This REL Northwest event is sponsored by the Institute of Education Sciences. REL Northwest is one of 10 federally funded laboratories dedicated to improving the use of evidence in education policy and practice. We here primarily serve the 5 Northwest states, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho, through research, technical assistance, and dissemination activities. Following the webinar, you will receive an evaluation via email. Please, please, please take the time to complete the survey. It really helps us continually improve our services, and it will be short, I promise. I am Elabella Jamor of the Regional Educational Lab here in the Northwest, and today you are going to be hearing from Michael Luke Kolmos on strategies to communicate about educator evaluation and support systems. And I will hand it over to Luke, who can introduce himself and get us all started.
Hello. So I'm Luke Kolmos. I am recently from the Tennessee Department of Education, and I'm continuing to work with them on implementing certain aspects of evaluation. When I was at the department, I led the evaluation team from the state, so we were responsible for data management, for a lot of communication, which is what we're going to focus on today, just kind of all aspects of implementing evaluation across the entire state. And Tennessee had their first full year of implementation in 2011-12 and have been kind of implementing and learning ever since then. So I think that's the name of the game. And Helen, do you want to say anything else before we get moving?
No, go for it, Luke. Thank you.
All right. So I think where we will start is why is communication so important? And what it really boils down to is for most of the people making a lot of decisions about how evaluation works. They are not the ones who are necessarily doing the observing or the evaluating. They're creating the systems, they're encouraging others to observe effectively, make good decisions, things like that. So, so one way to think about that is that every message you send is leading to someone else's action. It's not necessarily your action that's making the difference. It really isn't just about how good you are at doing evaluation. It's also how good you are at talking about evaluation. Talking about evaluation is a real impact on how well people implement. Another way to think about that is, you might be the best teacher observer anywhere. You can go observe a teacher in a classroom and quickly identify their strengths, their weaknesses, exactly what type of feedback to deliver them. But you knowing that is not going to mean that everyone else who's doing observation knows that. So alternatively, you could also be the best kind of data analyst ever. You can look at all this evaluation data, you can manage it really effectively to make really good decisions about professional development, about personnel, about anything. But if you're not able to communicate that for the people who are actually making decisions, then it's not going to lead to the actions that you really want. So thinking about communication independent of implementation is probably not going to serve you well as you try to encourage others to make the right decisions, to take the right actions. And so that's kind of why we're here today. So some of the key things to think about when you're talking about evaluation are, do you have good internal logic? Are you being responsive? Is there clear purpose? Is there belief that what you are doing is important? All this really boils down to like knowing why you're making the decisions you are making, and remain committed to communicating those decisions, communicating the why, communicating the how, communicating the what, because that's what the folks in the field are really going to need to know. And so I think that, by kind of pushing all of that in conjunction, then folks start to understand, oh, there are reasons that we're doing this in a certain way. There are ways that I have flexibility and I want to think through my decisions there. it really starts to empower the people who are having the conversations with teachers. It starts to empower the teachers who are going through what can often be a difficult process. All of these things are connected, which is why you can't kind of sit communication off to the side, excuse me, take communication off to the side and think of it as something that you're adding on to the core work of actually doing the evaluation. It is very much a part of the doing. So what does that really mean? A lot of it means having a pretty specific internal mindset because there are going to be certain things that you can control and certain things that you can't control about how evaluation is happening. If you're a principal in your school, if you're a district leader in all of your schools, if you're a state person in all of your districts, if you're an outside entity in the people that you are supporting or influencing. But there are things that you can't control, and those things that you can't control will influence the actions of others. And a lot of it comes back to that kind of both what you're communicating out, but also that two-way communication that's happening. And so some of those things are like kind of, pretty straightforward around customer service. You really have to commit to that excellence, and that includes being responsive. That includes being positive even when you're having hard conversations. That includes pushing your message even in those small interactions like that random email question that you got yesterday, or that phone call, or the side conversation you have when you're doing a presentation. That commitment to excellence will start to generate better kind of experiences for your customers. And those positive experiences should gain momentum over time, right? So when you're responding to an upset teacher who feels like something didn't go well in their observation process, for example, when that conversation is over, you and the teacher may not agree on things. That's totally fine, but you want to make sure that that teacher feels like they got heard, feels like they got answers to their questions even if they don't agree with them. They want to feel like they were treated like a respected human being. So those things are part of that commitment to excellence and really being detail-oriented and specific in everything that you do, because that's what starts to yield those more positive experiences. It's also kind of a way of getting to know your customers, right? So what that really means is, like, in all conversations, in formal and by informal and informal means, you must be gathering feedback from your people. You have to be identifying where their barriers are and getting them some of those wins, right? And you have to be responsive to the feedback that you're getting. So that means that, if the problem that is just killing everybody is that wherever they're entering their data, they have to click an extra time, which doesn't seem that bad, but when you do it 1,000 times in a school year, those 1,000 extra clicks get pretty annoying. Then maybe that's the win that you can deliver to some of your principals so that they don't have to do that anymore. Kind of just emphasizing all the time that even those small wins matter, and that you want the principals to feel successful, you want the teachers to feel successful, you want the students to succeed, so that together everyone's kind of sharing success. Now that can be a difficult thing to communicate, especially when emotions are high, but you just have to kind of stay in there. Keep saying it, keep believing it, keep acting it out, and momentum will start to shift. The last bullet here is perhaps the most important. You have to be clear, consistent, and quick when you're communicating, especially if you're starting to implement kind of in the near future or right now. And that involves more than just we know what our kind of top line key messages are that we want to say. It means having a clear process. Because you're going to be responding to things that you haven't even thought of before. So that means, controlling your message. That means, who should be handing out information. That means, who kind of the communications team is, and maybe that won't live exclusively with the people who are kind of implementing the evaluation. But you're going to want to know if we have a question that seems really difficult or confusing or may require escalation for someone else to make a decision, we know kind of what the process is to get the answer we need so we can stay responsive. So that could mean we got an email today. We all sat down at the end of the day to go through all the questions we got in email that we didn't know how to answer. We found one that none of us knew how to answer, so we passed it up the food chain to the assistant commissioner or assistant superintendent, who said, this is the answer. We crafted the email response, we run it back by the assistant commissioner, it gives us the green light, and we send it out, right? So like there's a clear process that's flexible, that can be responsive to things that come up. It also means that sometimes you might have to play a little bit of internal hardball where you have to tell someone from another office maybe, you know, I appreciate you're getting a lot of questions about evaluation, but I really appreciate if you routed those questions directly to me because we want to make sure that all answers are consistent to kind of stave off the misinformation that often comes up when you're implementing new change. So these are all kind of things that you can kind of control within your own team, right? You have very high expectations for yourself. You stay super responsive, customer service oriented, and then you set up those processes so that whatever's happening, you can respond, adjust and respond. When I was in Tennessee, pretty early on when we were getting a very large volume of questions, we would every day huddle in the afternoon and just go through all the questions one by one and answer them. And part of that was just a way to clear the volume of questions, but also keeping everybody on the evaluation team on the same page about what the answers were and why we were answering them in certain ways. That also is how you kind of start to build your internal logic over time. Now, once you are kind of communicating a lot and consistently and you're developing relationships with the folks you are supporting, you can start to kind of figure out who are the kind of implementation leaders. You know, who are, if you're a state, who are the districts that are really seizing ownership and making evaluation their own, who are the principals, if you're in a district, who are really buying into the whole concept of evaluation and feedback. If you're at a school, which teachers are open to the process, interested in getting good feedback. You can start to find these leaders and really cultivate positive relationships with them about, you know, like, I trust you, I want to make sure that you're succeeding in this world of new evaluation. And also kind of, because I believe in you, can you also, you know, make sure that you're feeding me feedback all the time? Because, you know, the truth is, I trust your feedback more because I know how much you believe in this stuff. So that's where you can start to get kind of better information about what's actually happening, but also start to introduce a little bit of experimentation, right? So like evaluation is probably not going to look exactly the same in every classroom, in every school, in every district across the state or within a district or whatever. So when folks are kind of solving the issues that exist between the lines of any policy or any well-intentioned training, there's always going to be kind of things that don't quite fit. These are the people who you are going to want to be thinking through the implementation challenges that you didn't think of, who are going to be taking the risks that you need taken to find out what really works in reality. And you're going to want to know what they're doing and learning from them. And then when you find something really good, you're going to want to share that knowledge freely. So it's really about transparency and building up others to be empowered, which I know is a hard balance to strike when I just said you really need to have like tight control over communication and messaging. But I think they're not totally mutually exclusive, right? So you can be a unified front as a principal, as a district leader, as a part of a state agency, as an outside influencer, whatever. But you also need to be building up kind of those other folks who are going to be doing a lot of the leading on learning and implementation with evaluation. getting a little deeper into the kind of feedback and learning, which I think is a central part of communication. It's that two-way conversation that's happening all the time. The first thing is you have to maintain feedback loops, and a lot of times that has to be a very intentional effort. So that can be the obvious things like surveys, but don't forget that you are also gathering feedback through emails and meetings, and sometimes there are meetings that are explicitly about feedback, but pretty much, any presentation you go to, someone's probably going to have an opinion to share with you. That's all legitimate and important feedback. And also don't forget like school visits, classroom visits to really see what's happening. And each of these different types of feedback can kind of serve a different purpose, right? So like your large-scale surveys, that can be something that you can report and say like, look, this is what we heard from people. You can track that over time, kind of make some conclusions about the trends that you're seeing. That might be a little bit different than an in-depth conversation you have with a teacher about what's happening inside her classroom and inside her school. That may be the type of feedback that you're not reporting publicly, but is definitely influencing your decision-making moving forward. Now, if you have all this feedback, you need to turn it into something actionable for yourself, right? So, that means like turn all that information into learning. You gotta look at your data, you gotta figure out like where are folks struggling, where are folks doing well, what worked, what didn't. And this is where you start to merge kind of your quantitative data that you're collecting through evaluation with some of your qualitative things about the districts or the schools and their leaders. It also means kind of checking it against the qualitative feedback you're getting from surveys or just kind of daily emails. It's all about pooling all this information and learning as hard and fast as you can. And really what it boils down to is, you're asking teachers to keep on learning and adjusting because it's the best thing for students, because we believe that if they keep learning more about their practice and adjusting and making improvements based off of that information, things will get better. Same rules apply for you too, right? Like it's part of it's modeling, like this is what we believe, and part of it's just we believe that continuous improvement is important, and we continuously improve by being self-aware and reviewing the information in front of us and adjusting accordingly and experimenting, trying things that don't work and trying things that do work. So that has to be a central part of how you behave and also how you communicate, because your communication systems are part of the feedback, but also you need to talk about the adjustments you're making. So like you can go look up in Tennessee, there have been, I guess, probably 3 annual reports now that discuss what has been learned in the past year and what's going to change in the next year based on that learning. And, that's not going to convince everybody, but it does kind of set the expectation that the entire system is getting better and adjusting through time. And I just saw a question that is a wonderful topical question about what specific data do you review that shows who is doing well and who is struggling. So one of the ways that we looked at that in Tennessee is we have a value-added model for a healthy number of teachers across the state. So we identified schools where the value-added metrics and the classroom observation metrics were kind of at totally opposite ends of the spectrum. Most commonly, it would be folks getting very high observations and very low value-added. So a couple of times it was the opposite, and we didn't really worry about like, oh, if it was like a teacher or two, like that's not a big deal. But if it was systemically happening throughout an entire school, then we would say, like something might be a little bit off there. So that's like one way that we would look at it. There are also some teacher perception indicators that we would take a look at, which we could sometimes get down to the district level about, were teachers feeling like the feedback they were receiving was useful, things like that. That can also be indicative of like maybe someone's very good at going through the process, but they're not actually great at delivering the feedback, which is kind of part of the whole idea. And then we'd also kind of look at like, I would say especially during the first year, probably the thing we looked at was, or first couple of years, the things we looked at were, are you actually completing the process? So that was kind of more compliance oriented, but also try to head off at the path, like if people literally didn't know what to do, then, you know, that's on us to communicate better. So I think there's a variety of different things you can look at. The way that I would kind of tend to try to think about it is what will answer these questions, like, are you doing it, or are we doing it, which is more just like the implementation compliance part. Are we doing it well? So can we figure out, like, if the quality of implementation is pretty good, and then is it working? So that's more about program evaluation. Like, if we're doing it and we're doing it well and we're not seeing the results we expect, then we probably need to make an adjustment. But it's hard to make that call if you're not doing it at all, or if the quality of implementation is just not very good. Now, sometimes you can set up a system where the quality of implementation will never be good because it's so complicated, so that's something to think about too. But there's kind of a variety of different ways. And also, I shouldn't discount things like if we heard got a ton of like emails or got phone calls from like a specific school or specific district where there seemed to be a common issue, then like, yeah, we would pick up the phone and say, hey, we're getting a lot of kickback on this specific kind of question where it seems like people are confused about, you know, what their rights are, for example. So we just wanted to put that out there and kind of make sure you guys have the information you needed at the district level to address that concern. Or there were a couple times when we would pass along, or we would encourage teachers, you know, file a grievance with your district because and then let the district know that we've gotten a lot of kind of concerning communications from teachers about like a specific school where it seemed like maybe implementation was not going according to the process that teachers should expect. So I would say all kinds of ways. When you're looking at kind of the larger scale data, a lot of it depends on the type of data you have access to. That's a really important question, and something that as you're collecting data, be thinking about, why am I collecting this? What am I going to learn from collecting this? And then therefore, like, how should I respond once I kind of figure out what the patterns are? All right, so moving along. So as you're kind of learning and communicating and getting multiple years into implementation, you know, things are going to change, right? So like what is really important to communicate at the beginning is not going to be as important to communicate 2 years, 3 years down the road, because, you know, people get better at doing evaluation from practicing. The kind of misinformation that's out there changes. Maybe something that was troublesome got fixed, so now there's something new to be troubled about. You know, things will evolve over time. Things should evolve over time. So in that respect, you need to continue to kind of evolve your communication, evolve your system, and then evolve your communication based on how you are evolving the system as a whole. A lot of that has to do with kind of combating myths that kind of shift from year to year. So, for example, we use a value-added model, a measure of student learning in Tennessee that's pretty similar to student growth percentiles if you use those. There was a lot of talk about how, you know, our model was, you know, random and there were wild swings in scores. And this is a common critique. When we actually looked at the data, we found that our value-add model was kind of remarkably stable from year to year. So I think it was, you know, 90% of teachers would stay within one level of the score they had previously. I mean, it was so stable that I think people could have probably argued in the other direction that it was like too stable. But that was a good thing to research and be able to say, like, I hear what you're saying, and like, yes, in like 0.1% of cases, a teacher can like jump or fall a lot of levels. But in over 90% of cases, like, it's very stable. Actually, it's almost as stable as observation is, and far more stable than a couple of our other measures that were included through legislation. So our two measures that were the most stable were our kind of student learning measure, and then our kind of classroom practice measure. So that's like an important thing to be able to say. The other kind of thing about thinking about kind of what your messaging is kind of identifying what you're worried about. So, you know, at the very beginning, we were deeply concerned about like announced versus unannounced observations. We were worried about our unannounced observations actually unannounced, and we need to be really strict about this. We're going to talk about it a lot, which is an important decision to make because you only have so much airtime, and so what you choose to talk about is incredibly important. So you really want to focus on talking about the most important things. So that's the first year we talked a lot about announced and unannounced observations. Now, after we started to see the data that there was very little difference between announced and unannounced observations, and that was true across virtually everywhere. So in places where we had a lot of faith in their quality of implementation and in places where we had less faith, we were like, maybe this is not something worth worrying about. It doesn't seem to materially affect scores. Everyone seems to be kind of experiencing the same thing quantitatively. So we're just not going to be all that worried about announced and unannounced observations. Not going to be a point of emphasis, still part of the system. Another thing that we were very worried about, and I would say is an ongoing worry for most evaluation systems, is about score inflation on observations. And I think that we're probably still worried about it, but we are less worried about score inflation than we used to be because kind of the ranking of teachers is, you know, pretty accurate and pretty consistent. And while we have a 5-level kind of observation rubric, and most people are in the top 3 levels, but there's a pretty good spread across those top 3 levels, and then not very many people are at the very bottom. So, you know, like, yeah, that probably is not completely an accurate picture of the quality of instruction happening in classrooms, but there is actually a lot more differentiation happening now than there was 5 years ago when it was like 98% of people in the top level. Now we're differentiating really well across 3 levels with a few people falling into the bottom 2 levels. So yes, we're worried about score inflation, but not as much as we used to be because there is kind of that differentiation and to some extent accurate ranking happening. So part of it's kind of figuring out like what are we worried about now, what's our point of emphasis, but also kind of thinking about like how do you introduce innovation into your system? How do you keep the system alive and evolving? So that can mean student perception surveys, for example. Might be a good idea for some districts, but not all. How can you introduce it and kind of experiment with it and see if it's a good idea? Or portfolio growth models, which is kind of value added for non-tested teachers would be the way I would describe it. Like you can start small and grow it and kind of figure out how to do some of these new things. And part of the communication there is saying like we're always trying new things to strengthen the system, which is actually a pretty good response to have for folks who are like, well, what about this group of teachers? This system doesn't work for them. It's like, all right, like let's sit down. Let's figure out a potential answer and let's test it out. Let's do it. So kind of that innovation is a way to keep things flexible enough that you can absorb criticism and feedback and often take some folks who may be unimpressed with your system and make them your allies in making the system stronger, which is kind of your best case scenario and has definitely happened with a couple of educator groups in Tennessee. Now, part of evolution is also kind of setting your agenda looking forward. So I think, and sometimes it means not making a change and explaining why. So I think a good example from Tennessee is as new standards were introduced to the state, new academic standards, there's a lot of conversation about do we need to adjust the observation rubrics to align them better with the new higher academic standards? Or do we need to add more rubrics to take into account more different types of teachers. And there was a lot of conversation about this, both with folks from the field, both inside the State Department, and where we landed essentially was we'll make a couple of minor tweaks to the observation rubric to kind of make the vocabulary used in teacher evaluation more similar to the vocabulary used when talking about the higher standards, academic standards. But we didn't want to do a massive overhaul because we didn't want to create that much additional change again a couple of years after a huge change of rolling out evaluation in the first place. We felt like our school leaders were starting to master the current rubric, and we didn't want to kind of hang them out there with something brand new to learn. And we kind of came to a similar conclusion on adding new rubrics. There's a lot of reasons people believe in more rubrics for more different types of educators. And I think that it's a very worthy conversation to have. Where we ultimately landed was we're going to keep few rubrics that are flexible and can be applied in many different contexts because it's less complicated for the observers to kind of master these different rubrics. You're upping the complexity a huge amount by having a lot more rubrics for different roles. Now, it does put pressure on the school leader to be able to apply a more general rubric in different contexts, but we felt more confident about our ability to support people doing that than having them kind of deeply understand 15 different rubrics. So being able to talk about those decisions and why you made them and who you talked to, like that's also part of evolving. So it goes both ways. Like, are you making a change? Are you not making a change? As long as you are able to talk about it within the context of your broader system and kind of what the logic was and the why and the purpose, then you can kind of be clear with people, but also build confidence that these are not just random and arbitrary decisions that are getting made. There is kind of some purpose to them, and the purpose always comes back to how are we setting up a system that will lead to teachers getting even better and students learning even more. So I think it's a very important thing to contemplate as you go through the process. And we're going to go to the next slide, just taking its time on my computer. Looks like my WebEx has slowed down a little bit. There we go. So, we're going to wrap up pretty soon, but I did want to highlight one thing about as you kind of go through implementation, and folks implement in all kinds of different ways, right? There's normally some kind of piloting and then some kind of implementation process, and sometimes it takes multiple years to phase in full implementation. Sometimes people dive in immediately. Sometimes pilots last multiple years. There's a lot of different ways to do this, which is why it is very important to communicate very clearly about what is actually happening and what are the stakes. So the way it happened in Tennessee was there was a small and quick pilot and then immediately full statewide implementation, all measures 1 year. So it was very much ripping the Band-Aid off. Now, I am biased, but I think there's a lot of reasons that that's a good approach, namely that I think the quality of your learning is better when when it's for real, when things are actually happening for real. And also I think it kind of helps you shift the status quo faster so you don't get stuck in kind of partial implementation where things are never going perfectly, because things never go perfectly, and so it's hard to kind of get over the hump to real full implementation. But I think that there's a lot of reasons why people would disagree with me on that, and they would be right too. So either way, whatever your approach is, you need to be very clear about what the stakes are. And sometimes that means, there are no stakes. This is just a pilot, but we're still going to give you ratings. Now, for a teacher, that means that there are stakes. There's an emotional punch to going through more rigorous evaluation for the first time. and I think all of us can probably relate to that. Anyone who's ever had a performance review, you know, you can think that it's useful, you can think it's a great idea, you can even enjoy it in some ways, but it's not like the most fun thing that you would choose and be like, man, like when I think about the top 5 things that I do at work, like getting reviewed for my performance is like totally up there. I don't think many people, if any people, feel that way. So even just going through the process will matter to teachers and cause anxiety. So I think like having no stakes does not take the pressure off. But you need to be able to be upfront about addressing the concerns that teachers are going to have. You know, does this factor into my pay, my tenure, anything? Can you use this information to make personnel decisions? Is this different from how it was last year? You know, like these are the things that are going to cause people a lot of anxiety, and it is very understandable, and they are right. They need to know these things. And the truth is that, you know, even if the impact is small, people are going to still respond. It's an intrinsically difficult and emotional activity. But it's on you guys to know what the stakes are. I think one of the challenges of kind of going through extensive piloting is you have to be very explicit and clear, especially with yourselves actually, about like what are you even trying to learn and how are you going to adjust based on that learning moving forward. Like, are there certain benchmarks that you need to hit to move forward the next year? Like, what are you really looking for so that you, those kind of two dangers. One, you get stuck in neutral, but then the other is you go through a pilot, you don't actually learn anything. It was just like part of like one step on the way to the finish line. And then you just implement and don't take into account all the stuff that happened during the pilot. So I think going through that full pilot process is good development, but you need to be incredibly disciplined about putting that into, putting that learning into practice. And the reason I highlight this is because ultimately, you know, how does this count is at the heart of what causes a lot of anxiety, and sometimes it's a hard question to answer. So like, how do you emphasize to a teacher that like, yes, you should care about this process, but no, you shouldn't be super worried? It's a kind of hard middle ground to land in. If you de-emphasize stakes too much and kind of push the like, it doesn't even matter message, then like, if you're a teacher, then my question would be, so why are you wasting my time? I'm busy. So I think figuring out how to talk about the stakes involved is something that should not be underestimated and is directly connected to the very real and understandable anxiety folks are going to go through during the process. So that's something to keep in mind. And then it's always important to remember kind of what should be coming out of any evaluation system. So using Tennessee as my example, you know, during that first year of implementation, nearly 300,000 conversations about instruction happened across the state. That's a lot of conversations. I think having all those conversations compared to not having them is certainly a step in the right direction, but you know, the next challenge is like, so what are you going to do with all those conversations? Think about the power of making those 300,000 conversations like a little bit more useful every year. One of our kind of pieces of feedback about where we weren't doing well as a state was the quality of feedback teachers were getting during those feedback conversations. So, you know, that shifted our emphasis from straight up process implementation, where we felt like people were doing pretty well and kind of hitting all the right steps, to making sure that those conversations were high quality. And I think there's been some momentum in seeing progress there. And so I think, you know, keeping your eye on that prize, like what we really care about is observers and teachers having really substantive conversations about instructional practice and figuring out together what can a teacher do to help students learn even more, no matter where they are on the performance spectrum, no matter where the teacher is or the student is on the performance spectrum. So I think always remember kind of what your finish line is, and then everything else starts to fall into place about kind of the decisions you make, what you think are important, which messages you emphasize, how you respond to people who are identifying issues in your evaluation system. So I think kind of keep your eye on the finish line. I'm going to hop to one last slide before we do the Q&A. So I show you this slide. This is some data from a statewide teacher perception survey that Tennessee does every year. These are just two of the questions asking teachers, will evaluation improve their teaching, and is evaluation fair? So 2012 was that first year of implementation. The middle bar is the second year of implementation, and then the green bar is the most recent year that just ended, so 14-15 school year. The results just came out. And I show you these for three reasons. One is that people are going to be really unhappy the first year you're implementing a large scale change that is emotionally difficult. That's okay, but just know people are going to be unhappy. Get ready. Put your armor on. I think a big lesson here is that once you get through that first year, it's going to be tough. If you improve, if you're reasonable, if you make good decisions, if you communicate like a human being, then things will start to get better pretty quickly, because K-12 educators are way more flexible than people give them credit for. They're constantly working their way through change, and like everybody else, they don't like it that much at first, but when the status quo shifts, it's fine. So I think you will see a jump in perceptions from that first year to that second year if you kind of just keep sound fundamentals. And then the other reason I wanted to show you this is that it is very useful to know if you're seeing a positive trend on things like this, right? So during that first year, the narrative was everybody hates evaluation, this is a disaster. During the subsequent years, people were still saying everyone hates evaluation, this is a disaster, because that's what we heard 2 years ago. It is incredibly useful to be able to say, actually, the momentum has shifted. Actually, more than 2/3 of teachers think evaluation is improving their teaching. Now that's a number that we would want to say, yeah, better, but also a number I'm willing to stand behind and say, look, that's a powerful thing. That's going to look better than if you ask a lot of teachers how they felt about evaluation in the past, where probably almost nobody would say it was useful in helping them improve their teaching. So I think there's both the using this to track whether you're being successful in making adjustments, but also using this as a communication tool to push back, to provide counter narrative to what is often out there as a general perception, including to principals who are implementing, right? So one of my favorite things was always saying to principals, I know that you're hearing me a lot from the people who are unhappy, but I'm telling you that whatever you're doing, whatever you're telling your staff, whatever conversations you're having about feedback, guess what? That silent majority exists, and that has so much to do with your school leaders. But they don't necessarily feel that. So being able to let them know and support them there is also fairly valuable. So I'm going to stop there, flip it back to our kind of finish line conversation about how many conversations you get to play with, and take questions.
Thank you, Luke. That was very interesting. We are opening up for Q&A now, so please type your questions in the Q&A panel or raise your hand if you'd like to voice your question. And I'll get us started with a question that came in advance. So what you've talked about is a great plan, but it's a lot of work, and it's work that Tennessee has developed over time. If an agency at this point could only address 3 issues among all the ones that you listed, which should be those first 3?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because prioritization is incredibly important in going through this. So I'd say number 1 is have a communication process. But that is different than a communication plan. I think having a plan is good, but the second that you kind of finalize your plan, it is already obsolete because the world's moving fast. So have a communication process that's flexible and responsive so that you have ways to pump out new communication. You know who needs to vet it, you know who's going to write it, things like that. So what we did at the department as kind of a tangible example, I already told you about our kind of daily email huddles, which eventually we got to stop doing, but we also had a weekly e-newsletter that would kind of outline, like, here's what you need to be doing in the process right now, but also would be responding to common questions or common misperceptions. We pump it out weekly. We had someone who was responsible for writing it and kind of keeping track of the key topics we wanted to discuss. We had a certain day that we would show it to my boss, who would review it, and then we would have a certain day when we would pass it up to the commissioner, who would then review it and give it back to us on a certain day that we would send it out. And it was every single week, without fail, on the same schedule. So that was kind of one process that we had, and also a way that we were kind of effectively communicating up all the decisions we were making so that someone could kind of tap the brakes for us if we were going down the wrong path. So having a flexible process in place on communication is hugely important, and having it be flexible enough that you can, you know, respond in less than 24 hours in some cases, or if there's something more in depth, then you have like a full drawn out weekly process or something like that. So that's one. Two is having a kind of continuous improvement cycle mapped out. So that means, like, what are you actually going to make improvements to your system? How are you going to set the agenda for change? How do you introduce change? Who are you asking for feedback? How are you asking them for feedback? So for example, like there's some things that we had to bring before our state board of education. There were some things where we would try to, we wouldn't introduce legislation, but we would kind of have a legislative package where we would say, like, we think that these things need to change in the law based on this feedback. We had an annual report to kind of set the agenda for those things. And we had a way of kind of communicating about it. So saying, like, we gathered a bunch of feedback, this is what we think needs to change. So having that annual cycle is important. It also kind of keeps you honest on making sure that you are actually continuously improving. And our annual reports in some ways kind of were just like the to-do list for the year, like, yep, we made that better, we made that better, we made that better, we missed on this one didn't work out. So I think that kind of continuous improvement cycle, like knowing that you're like planning to change things, planning to make things better, and being able to tell people that you have that cycle in place is pretty important, especially at the beginning when there's going to be a lot of things you're going to want to fix pretty quickly. And then number three is know why you are making people do all of this. And the answer cannot be because it's the law or something like that. Whatever your reason is, that's your guiding star. It's going to help you make better decisions, and it'll help other people make better decisions. So, like, if your guiding star is we want to create a feedback system to help teachers improve, then everything should be centered around, you know, that classroom level improvement. Or if your guiding star is we want to create a bunch of information to help people make better decisions in a variety of ways, then, like, that's your guiding star. The decisions you make should be centered around that. And ultimately, whatever your big reason is, it needs to lead to, you know, better student outcomes. So the three things are communication process, continuous improvement cycle, and know why you're doing this. It's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work for you. It's a lot of work for the people observing. It's a lot of work for teachers. So making sure there's a reason for it all is kind of the probably the most important thing that you can do and communicate. So yeah, that's the answer.
Thank you. Before I ask a follow-up question, I wanted to give folks who may be on the audio only an opportunity to ask questions. Is anyone on audio only and has a question? Okay, so we, as a follow-up question to this, how would your answer change if I asked you what are the three top things that an agency could do specifically in order to reduce anxiety?
Good question. So I think that's a hard one. Reducing it. So I think part of my answer is there's going to be anxiety. And so the way to get through a lot of that anxiety is to like implement as fast as you can so you can get to the end of the year and show people that nothing really bad happened to them. I think that there are trade-offs to that, but I do think that we saw a drop in anxiety after the first year of implementation compared to like before and during, because before people go all the way through the process, what they are thinking about, what they're anxious about are all the worst case scenarios. Then you get to the end of the year and like nothing bad happens, then it's kind of like, okay, whatever, like that's old news now, I'm going to worry about something new. And I think that did happen to an extent with evaluation in Tennessee. Like right now, I would say it's probably not a headline for what's giving people anxiety. So that's probably part of my answer is implement and be as excellent as possible while you're doing it. I think being ultra responsive matters. Now, you're not going to get to like big scale that way because like probably a relatively small percentage of people are actually going to be like sending you emails with questions. But the idea that you can email out a question and you get an answer that makes sense and is in real live English and is quick and accurate, that just knowing that can relieve anxiety for some people, and they can kind of pass along that relieved anxiety, right? So it's like if you can get even some people thinking like, that doesn't make sense, let me ask, and then you can like get ahead of it and get them the answer, like mission accomplished. People thinking, that doesn't make sense, and then not asking, they're going to have anxiety. People who are thinking, that doesn't make sense, send an email and never hear back are going to be super anxious and angry because it just remains unresolved. It's like a new thing. Now they're thinking like, and I can't even get help. So I think that responsiveness is huge for relieving anxiety. And then the other thing is, just your messaging about why we're doing this. Like you just have to be real disciplined about it. You have to keep it positive. You have to focus on how this is going to help the 95% of teachers who are doing a great job, or 99% or 90% or whatever. And this is not about the bottom 1% or bottom 5% or bottom 10%, right? So like the way you talk about evaluation needs to be framed around how this is helping to manage and improve the vast majority of your teachers, not the tiny minority who maybe are not the right folks to be in the classroom. Because ultimately, if all this effort was only about the bottom 5%, then like the benefits may not outweigh the costs. But if you're actually creating a system where even your best teachers are finding ways to get better, and you're kind of marginally improving 95% of everybody, then like that's a real systemic impact that's positive and is a happy thing for everybody, including students, and is also part of like a happy workplace environment where people feel like they are gaining autonomy, being successful, getting better, adding new skills. So I think like that's probably the third thing is being real disciplined about talking about the vast majority of the teachers that this is aimed at.
Thank you. I think our audience appreciates what you said about communicating quickly and consistently, because very often we're so busy implementing these kinds of changes that communications is an afterthought. It comes when something goes wrong. And I know that a key part of that is the feedback loop, and to be very intentional about that. Could you give an example or two of shifts that the department has made specifically based on feedback that you received through one of those loops?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them that happened during the first year of implementation was there was a lot of talk about how many observations were required and how much time it was taking. And so we had 3 different domains on our kind of main educator rubric. And so originally, every observation could only include observing one of the 3 domains. And midstream during the year, and this was super rare that we made major midstream changes like this. Midway through the year, we changed the rules so that you could combine 2 of the domains into 1 observation. So it's kind of like wonky, but the gist of it is you could cut in half the number of observations you did while still covering the same content, and every teacher still got observed at least twice during the year. So that was like, and also like bonus points, like knowing what we know now, like that was clearly the right move. So like it made a lot of sense, and kind of, I think I would venture to say improves the quality of observation. But that was largely in response to people, including trusted people who were like bought in, saying like it's too many required classroom visits that take too long. I mean, different principals kind of have different styles and things like that, but there is clearly a time crunch problem. So that was a midstream change in response to feedback that ended up being definitely the right call for instructional reasons also. But operationally, it was like hugely important. So I think that that's a pretty good example. Another kind of legislative example is we used school-wide value added for a group of teachers who were non-tested subjects. And this is actually an interesting one because for multiple years there was a lot of feedback in all directions about like, should school-wide value add be included and how much should it be included? And kind of surprisingly, unsurprisingly, I guess, there was a lot of different opinions on the matter, where school leaders especially said, yes, include school-wide value add for everybody, because it's a team-building tool that I use. But what we ended up doing was keeping it and then just reducing the weight, so it was worth 25% to 35%. And then I think this past year they reduced it again to 15% to kind of make room for some other things. So that's an example of like an ongoing conversation where it keeps getting kind of more and more refined, and we get feedback on that through surveys, through conversations, through email, through legislators, through everybody. Everyone has an opinion about school-wide value added. And so I think and we also actually had a whole feedback tour where that was one of our key questions. And that's where we really discovered that even teachers had vastly different opinions. So that's another example of like kind of specific kind of the weighting of the scores that we adjusted based on feedback.
Well, thank you, Luke. I think we could talk a lot more about these issues, but in the interest of time, we're going to stop here. Everyone, we appreciate your being with us today. Please remember to fill out the survey when you get it by email, and check out our website for a recording of the webinar and associated resources. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks.